So, as most of you know, my name is Lisa Findley. I'm the Interim Dean of Architecture here at CCA. This is the first of our fall lecture series. We have a theme this fall called Other Ways of Working. This theme picks up on CCA Architecture's commitment to introducing our students to the myriad ways architecture can be practiced. This is demonstrated by our faculty, brought into our curriculum in our advanced studios, and discussed in our professional practice courses and in numerous history theory seminars. This conversation also calls into question the idea of practice in a traditional sense. It models a wide variety of alternative ways to do architecture, and also introduces the ways that an education in architecture might lead to other pursuits in life. So our first lecturer is Garrett Jacobs, and to introduce him tonight, someone who most of you know, Shalini Agrawal, I never can say it, Agrawal, I can do it, who is the director of the Center for Art and Public Life here at CCA.
Hey everybody, my name is Shalini. Thank you, Lisa, for that introduction, and I'm really excited to kick off the lecture series. And I am the director of the Center for Art and Public Life, and those of you who are unfamiliar with the center, just a really quick plug, I promise. We facilitate community partnerships towards hands-on project-based learning here at CCA. We host Engage classes, which is classes that are embedded in your discipline with a community partner. We also place you, the students, at community partner sites through our Connects program. And we have an Impact Awards, which support student-led projects through grants available to you, the students. We will be, if you'd like to see more about Impact, the students from this past year will be presenting their projects October 23rd from 6 to 8 p.m. It's a super exciting event. You should all stop by. We'll have food and drinks as well. And this year we will be running Impact again, and it will have a local focus. And stay tuned for the spring where we'll be giving you more information. But this is a great way if you have an idea and you want to fund and you want to start a nonprofit like Open Architecture Collaborative. This is a great opportunity to get funding. So in this current climate of alternative news, alternate facts, alternate realities, and alternate weather, we also see alternate communities and practices emerging. At the helm of this emergent design practice, Garrett Jacobs, Executive Director of Open Architecture Collaborative, is committed to increasing the capacity of design professionals to better serve communities. Sorry, can't read my notes here. He has made it his responsibility to support practitioners and organizations in community-based design and planning, fostering in the new generation of practitioners through Open Architecture Collaborative, a global learning network that mobilizes architects and allied designers for greater community impact. Before launching the OAC, he worked with Code for America, running a national network of government staff using technology to improve public service and managed government relations in their flagship fellowship program. Trained as an architect in post-Katrina New Orleans, Garrett strives to understand the holistic implications of design decisions. In 2015, Garrett facilitated 30 volunteer chapters around the world in the co-creation of an organization that became the legacy of Architecture for Humanity. He focuses on producing opportunities for designers to reflect on privilege and build relationships with their neighbors experiencing systemic marginalization. He believes design is the tool to start the conversation and employing skills of community engagement, sharing access to knowledge, opening connections, and understanding the full political context of the built environment will advance social justice through design. He has an MArch from Tulane University and was selected as 2016 Next City Vanguard and named in Impact Design Hub's 40 Under 40. Please join me in giving a warm welcome to a collaborator, a friend, a friend of CCA, friend of the center, and a friend of mine, Garrett Jacobs.
Thank you, Lisa, and thank you, Shalini, for the introduction, as well as thank you for being a collaborator, source of inspiration. And if you want to talk about alternative practices, Shalini is also a great example. She is a designer as well, putting her skills and keeping me accountable to the work that we're doing to wonderful use here. I also want to thank some folks from CCA, Michael Bernard, who has been an incredible mentor and has really helped through a bunch of leadership challenges this past year. So thank you for being here and talking me through the presentation. As well as, again, the center has connected us with an intern, Yvonne Lin, who's been helping us where a lot of other folks have failed this past year with a bunch of infrastructure projects. So with that, thank you all for taking the time to be here tonight. Maybe braving the rain. That's something I don't usually say in the Bay Area. But I'm going to talk a little bit about my personal story in 3 acts, so you can kind of understand a little bit of sometimes things are happenstance, sometimes they take a push of energy with a lot of motivation. And think of the themes of a demand for architecture and identity of place kind of in the background as I talk. And so the 3 acts are just kind of popping the bubble. You know, what happened when I flung myself out of my network and context of where I grew up in the suburbs of Chicago, looking under the hood specifically of working for Architecture for Humanity and a couple other organizations and starting to understand the complexities of practice as it pertains to professional organizations. And then kind of moving beyond just good intentions and working with volunteers as I have over the past, maybe 11 years. So before I get into it, this is a long quote, but the gist of it is that everything is interconnected. And I'm going to talk about very specific projects in specific communities and efforts, but I believe wholeheartedly, and Dr. Mindy Thompson-Fullilove also has articulated very well and through research that everything is connected. We're all an emotional web, and so if one thing happens in your community, it's going to affect me tomorrow, the next day, the day after that. But it is all connected, and so I'm not talking about trying to effectively help someone who is other outside, but rather it's all connected, and we're doing this because it's all of these impacts are going to affect us all. So with that, here's the first part. Popping the bubble. I moved to New Orleans out of the suburbs of Chicago for architecture school 3 days before Hurricane Katrina. And so pretty early on, I started shifting my kind of understanding of what architecture was to what architecture could be. And I was really impacted by life that happens in the streets in New Orleans and how everything is very communal. And then also very impacted by the notion and action of the front stoop, a very small architectural element, but one that has huge significance in the city of New Orleans and just kind of the culture of the South and how people share the streets as front yards and almost as living rooms. And as I moved kind of further away from the university and more into the city, I lived on St. Anne Street in Mid-City. These are some of my neighbors, Sequin, Pat, Miss Jean, and Miss Teresa down there. They were kind of the mothers of the block. And I would get home from work, and everyone's door would be open, everyone would be sitting on their front stoops, and that would be like the living room. And then we would just kind of leave the doors open, and we would be like, who's cooking dinner tonight? Like, okay, who's got the cold drinks? And you would just be a much more kind of welcoming sense of community than I've ever felt. And so I kind of wanted to understand a little bit more about what made kind of New Orleans unique and framed this type of action in the street. And so I was also really impacted by Hurricane Katrina and then seeing kind of the long-term investments, disinvestments, promises, unfulfilled promises that happen in the city. So I started looking a little bit more about the geography of the city and kind of who ended up where. And kind of understanding that the high grounds are around the Mississippi River and then a little further up towards Lake Pontchartrain. And you can kind of see that that's the areas that were first filled in the city. It makes sense, right? The French Quarter is right here. That's a strategic bend in the river and on high ground. And so you kind of realize that there are swamps and cypress swamps in the back, and kind of that's where literally disease was with mosquitoes, and people started kind of living along the Mississippi River. And you can see these lines kind of that draw parallel to or perpendicular to the bends in the river, and that was in the plantations, and that's how the plantations would kind of be subdivided. And so there's this rich history of how the city kind of got developed and how it kind of filled in over the years. And here's just a section of the city, an exaggerated one in terms of length, but depth, you can see, the natural levee, and then, it dips a little bit, and then there are these high ground, the ridges, which are kind of some of the bigger avenues in the city, and of course where the richer homes are, and they're also older, and then kind of back in the swamps and then towards the lake. Now, it might be, sorry for the bad graphics, but this is done by an awesome cultural geographer named Rich Campanella. If you're interested in the subject of kind of how people settle in different areas, I would highly recommend looking him up. But you can see that, racially the city is also settled. High grounds kind of reserved for the white community, and it's been that way for hundreds of years. And then the rest of the city kind of slowly filled in with black communities and immigrant communities as well. Again, kind of the structure of the plantations, you'd have the plantation house like right by the river, and then further back you'd have slave quarters. And so there's just such a huge historical significance to how the city was developed. And then, of course, you have redlining. So can a show of hands, who knows what redlining is? Okay, so some of you. So in the 1930s, the federal government colluded with a bunch of banks to make interest rates and mortgage rates really difficult to get and really high in poor communities and in areas of high risk. These were typically all black communities and immigrant communities. And so that framed a lot of how pretty much all the cities in the U.S. are filled in terms of a racial makeup. And so the areas in red were considered high risk and really no loan or not really lending. And so you can see, again, it follows the same racial layout of the previous map. And of course, high ground as well. And so, Katrina happens, and look, the areas that flood are, of course, the low-lying areas that people couldn't get loans to build good houses or, appropriately responsive to flooding. And so you have mostly the communities of color that were affected. And so this was really evident in the way that the federal government didn't really respond to many areas of the city. And that's pretty much how I started my architectural career and how I went through school. And so knowing all of this, I was like, I can't really stand theoretical projects in the studio when there's just a city that needs tons of work. And so I did a lot of community engagement. I was able to teach middle schoolers and high schoolers, do some small design build projects throughout my tenure at school. And all of this, it had a huge impact on me, whereas the work in the studio, I just didn't find that interesting. And so I knew from pretty early on that I wasn't going to approach architectural in a traditional sense. One of my favorite projects that I got to work on was, this is one of the iconic images of Hurricane Katrina. This is Circle Food Store along St. Bernard Avenue, and this was a 120-year-old municipal market that was then turned into private market. And this was the first one-stop shop in the country before there were malls. The owner of this, Dwayne Boudreau, he just talked to everyone in the neighborhood and was like, hey, what do you need? Oh, you need uniforms for your kids? Cool, we'll have a uniform store. Oh, you need an optometrist? Cool, we'll put one in next year. And they did. And so the federal government promised them $5 million and never delivered. So for 7 years, he had to figure out how to fundraise, how to build partnerships to actually bring the store back. We just did a little bit of feasibility studies, some renderings to help them put together fundraising packages. But this is, I think, 3 years ago when they reopened the store. And Dwayne Boudreau is just an awesome community leader. So that was really cool to be a part of that. But that was the first time that I really understood that there is a huge value to the knowledge that we have of the systems that govern how architecture happens, that is not design, is not schematic, not design development, that can be beneficial to community members in making things happen. And so the kind of my last effort in New Orleans before I came out to the Bay Area was teaching these middle school kids, and that was amazing because we did this competition, and we're competing against other schools in the region that had fully resourced classes for this competition, and these kids were coming from schools all over the city, and I was just picking them up, and the organization really trusted me. It was something that would only happen in New Orleans, but also really powerful to see them practice public speaking and then becoming community organizers for other events. They have since started training young folks how to organize all over the Gulf South, especially in response to police brutality. They have become an incredible force at amplifying the youth voice. So again, an awesome opportunity there. So out of New Orleans, some of the things that I learned is that it's all about people and that you really just have to listen. Another one is just keep asking deeper questions. You know, what is architecture? Is it maybe an afterthought to some of these larger systemic questions? Continue asking why, and you'll get to something a little deeper. And then party in the street, just 'cause, always. It's really important to do things in public because it makes things accessible. The jazz scene in New Orleans is incredibly accessible because it's in the street, it's public, whereas in other cities it's just not really available. It's behind closed doors, maybe 18 and older. It's all of those things make the culture so accessible. Second part, so looking under the hood of Architecture for Humanity. Moved to San Francisco and became the organization's first coordinator for the entire global chapter network of the organization. And so what this kind of told me immediately is that the network had been operating for 10 years, but no one had ever been managing it. So again, it was not a resource of the organization that was supported. So this was the first time that I understood this work at scale, communications at scale, talking with people from all over the world, different languages, kind of different platforms. Maybe some people don't use email. How do you communicate with them? And so, you know, what are the standards of practice? All of these things were brand new to me because I'd only been working locally. These are some of the folks that were at the first chapter global meeting. Some of them are in this room. Hi, Matt. Anita's also in the back, helped run the LA chapter. So this was really fun, just trying to understand how we can all get on the same page and make collective decisions about what the network should be. And at that time, under the brand of Architecture for Humanity, was in and of itself another challenge. I also got the opportunity to work on large scale. To me, it was a $200,000 project in on Burroughs Street in the Portola neighborhood in San Francisco. It was largely a placemaking effort, but this one was funded by Architectural Digest and Lincoln Motor Company, so I got to quickly learn how to navigate a corporate sponsor for a community-based project. Tons of lessons learned there. I'll cover a few a little bit later. And I just want to talk about two projects in depth while I was at Architecture for Humanity that really impacted me, and talk about what I think design can bring to a project. So St. Elena de Piedritas School was in Peru in a pretty rural neighborhood, or pretty rural area. And this was an example of one of the programs, I think the only program that Architecture for Humanity really had, which was the Design Fellowship. They placed designers for up to a year, gave them a very small stipend, and put them on a larger scale design project, mostly funded by corporate social responsibility. So this one was funded by Enel, which is a huge power company in South America. Needless to say, Jesus did an incredible job. And that's Jesus. And one of the things that he kept central to his practice while doing this project was that every aspect of the building, he asked himself, how can we get people involved? What other capacity can we build? So this is, you can see basic school buildings and then some of the additions that they started doing on the outside. So again, immediately he landed and he got the kids involved. Like, what do you want to build? How do you want to build it? Started running workshops and actually took it to heart and had them building models and kind of really influencing what the design would look like. Not only that, but he realized that a lot of the women in the surrounding villages didn't necessarily have jobs. and he asked them, oh, can you get involved in this? Is this an opportunity here? And so he started realizing that there would be a need for kind of a proud cultural expression in the school, and they started recycling all these bottle caps and then just experimenting with them, and then eventually making them an element of the building. And so all of these sunshades are